Hello everyone, hope you've had a great Easter. We're nearly at the end of the book. Now, hopefully today we'll find out what happens to Paddington on the beach and more about his sandcastle. Instead of seeing me for this recording, what I've done is I put the words in front so you can enjoy and read along at the same time. Enjoy.
"Come on, Paddington," said Judy, lying there in the sun, fast asleep. "It was time for lunch, and we've got lots of work to do afterwards." Paddington felt disappointed. It had been a nice sandcastle in his dream. He was sure it would have won first prize. He rubbed his eyes and followed Judy and Jonathan up the beach to where Mrs. Bird had laid out the sandwiches. Ham, egg, and cheese for everyone else, and a special marmalade ones for Paddington, with ice cream and fruit salad to follow. "I vote," said Mr. Brown, who had in mind an after-lunch nap for himself, "that after we've eaten you all go off in different directions and make your own sandcastles. Then we'll have our own private competition, as well as the official one. I'll give £1 to the one with the biggest castle." All three thought this was a good idea. "But don't go too far away," called Mrs. Brown, as Jonathan and Judy and Paddington set off. "Remember, the tide's coming in." Her advice fell on deaf ears. They were all way too interested in sandcastles. Paddington especially was gripping his bucket and spade in a very determined fashion. The beach was crowded and he had to walk quite a long way before he found a deserted spot. First of all, he dug a big moat in a circle, leaving himself a drawbridge so that he could fetch and carry the sand and for the castle itself. Then he set to work carrying bucket loads of sand to the building to build the walls of the castle. He was an industrious bear, and even though he was hard at work, his legs and paws soon got tired. He persevered until he had a huge pile of sand in the middle of his circle. Then he set to work with his spade, smoothing out over the walls to make the battlements. They were good battlements with holes for windows and slots for the archers to fire through. When he had finished, he stuck his spade in one of the corner towers and placed the hat on top of that. And then he lay down inside next to his marmalade jar and closed his eyes. He felt tired, but very pleased with himself. With the gentle roar of the sea in his ears, he soon went fast asleep. "We've all been along the beach," said Jonathan, "and we can't see him anywhere." "He didn't even have his lifeboat with him," Mrs. Brown said anxiously. "Nothing, just a bucket and spade." The Browns were gathered in a worried group around the man from the life-saving hut. "He's been gone several hours," said Mr. Brown, "and the tide's been in over 2. The man looked serious. "And you say he can't swim?" he asked. "He doesn't even like having a bath much," said Judy, "so I'm sure he can't swim." "He's in the photograph," said Mrs. Bird. "He only had it taken this morning." She handed the man Paddington's picture and then dabbed her eyes with the handkerchief. "I know something's happened to him. He wouldn't have missed his tea unless something was wrong." The man looked at the picture. "We could send out a description," he said dubiously, "but it's a job to see what he looks like by that. It's all hat and dark glasses." "You can't launch a lifeboat?" asked Jonathan, hopefully. "We could," said the man, "if we knew where to look, but he might be anywhere." "Oh dear!" Mrs. Brown reached for her handkerchief as well. "I can't bear to think about it." "Something will turn up," said Mrs. Bird, comfortingly. "He's got a good head on his shoulders." "Well," said the man, holding up a dripping straw hat, "you'd better have this in the meantime, and we'll see what we can do." There, Mary." Mr. Brown held his wife's arm. "Perhaps she's just left it on the beach or something. It may have got picked up by the tide." He bent down to pick up the rest of Paddington's belongings. They seemed very small and lonely lying there on their own. "It's Paddington's hat all right," said Judy, examining it. "Look, it's got his mark inside." She just turned the hat inside out and showed them, and the outline of a paw mark in black ink with the words, "My hat, Paddington." "I vote we all separate," said Jonathan, "and comb the beach. We stand more a chance of finding him that way. Mr. Brown looked dubious. It's getting dark, he said. Mrs. Bird put down the travelling rug and folded her arms. Well, I'm not going back until he's found, she said. I couldn't go back to that empty house, not without Paddington. No one's thinking of going back without him, Mrs. Bird said. Mr. Brown, he looked helplessly out to sea. It's just... Perhaps he didn't get swept out to sea, said the life-saving man hopefully. Perhaps he's just gone on the pier or something. There seems to be a big crowd heading that way. Must be something interesting going on. He called out to the man who was just passing. What's going on at the pier, chum? Without stopping, the man looked back over his shoulder and shouted, Chap just crossed the Atlantic, all by himself on a raft. Hundreds of days without food or water, they say. He hurried on. The life-saving man looked disappointed. Another of these publicity stunts, he said. We get 'em every year. Mr. Brown looked thoughtful. I wonder, he said, looking in the direction of the pier. It would be just like him, said Mrs. Bird. It's the sort of thing that would happen to Paddington. It's got to be, cried Jonathan. It's just got to be. They all looked at each other and then, picking up their belongings, joined the crowd hurrying in the direction of the pier. It took them a long time to force their way through the turnstile, for the news that something was happening on the pier had spread and there was a giant throng at the entrance. But eventually, after Mr. Brown had spoken to the policeman, a way was made for them and they were escorted to the very end, where the paddle steamers normally tied up. A strange sight met their eyes. Paddington, who had just been pulled out of the water by a fisherman, was sitting on an upturned bucket, talking to some reporters. Several of them were taking photographs, while the rest fired questions at him. Have you come all the way from America? Asked one reporter. The Browns, hardly knowing whether to laugh or cry, waited eagerly for Paddington's reply. Well, no, said Paddington truthfully. After a moment's pause. Not America. I've come a long way. He waved his paw vaguely in the direction of the sea. I got caught by the tide, you know. And you were sat in that bucket all the time? Asked another. The man taking a picture. That's right, replied Paddington. And I used my spade as a paddle. It was lucky I had it with me. Did you live on plankton? Queried another voice. Paddington looked puzzled. No, he said. Marmalade, of course. Mr. Brown pushed his way through the crowd. Paddington jumped up and looked rather guilty. Now then, said Mr. Brown, taking his paw. That's enough questions for today. The bear's been at sea for a long time, and he's tired. In fact, he looked meaningfully at Paddington. He said he's been at sea all afternoon. Is it still only Tuesday? Asked Paddington innocently. I thought it was much later than that. Tuesday, said Mr. Brown firmly, and we've been worried to death over you. Paddington picked up his bucket and spade and jar of marmalade. Well, he said, I bet not many bears have gone to sea with a bucket all the same. It was dark when they drove along the bright sea front on their way home. The promenade was festooned with coloured lights, and even the fountains in the gardens kept changing colour. It all looked very pretty, but Paddington, who was lying in the back of the car wrapped in a blanket, was thinking of his sandcastle. I bet mine was bigger than anyone else's, he said sleepily. I bet your mine was the biggest, said Jonathan. I think, said Mr. Brown hastily, you'd all better just have a pound just to make sure. Perhaps we could come again another day, said Mrs. Brown, and then we can have another competition. How about that, Paddington? There was no reply from the back of the car. Sandcastles, paddling in his bucket all across the harbour, and all of that sea air had proven too much for Paddington. He was fast asleep.
I hope you enjoyed that part of Paddington Bear. Now, who do you think is going to be the next teacher tomorrow? I'll also post my questions below. Have a go at trying to answer them. Good luck!